have them on paper. So
okay, so
and that was why I yeah.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce Helena Mattsson, a professor in history and theory at the KTH School of Architecture in Stockholm, to give this afternoon's 5th lecture in our 7-part series entitled Architecture and Civic Service, which is examining the administrative roles architects play in designing the city. In today's lecture entitled The Co-Housing Movement Stockholm, Helena will trace the entangled history of collective houses and services from the intense discourse of services in the 1960s as a reaction to large-scale suburban areas to the new landscapes of the 1980s. She will outline how a second wave of collective houses in the 1980s explored the interplay between feminist emancipation and the new emerging economy at that time. Helena research deals with 20th century theory on the welfare state architecture and contemporary architectural history with a special focus on the interdependency between politics, economy, and spatial organizations. She's the co-editor of publications such as Swedish Modernism, Architecture, Consumption, and the Welfare State, the themed issue of Architecture and Culture entitled Architecture and Capitalism, Solids and Flows, and Neoliberalism on the Ground, Architecture and Transformation from the 1960s to the present. She is currently working on a book on the neoliberalization of the 1980s welfare state, which is set to be released in 2022. She is part of the group Action Archive and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Architecture. Well, it's a pleasure to have you back to the TU Delft in general, where you've been a rather constant guest, I would say, but this is the first time we've had the pleasure to welcome you to the Berlage in particular. So thank you so much for accepting this lecture invitation, Helena, and we very much look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Salomon, for this very generous introduction, and I'm very happy to be able to talk to you today. But of course, I'm also very sad that I'm not able to be there in person and meet you in person too. However, now I'm sitting here in my home, thinking about the home, writing about the home, investigating the home, and so forth. So maybe you recall Rainer Banham's well-known statement, "A home is not a house." And I often think about that now, because maybe it has not been that topical as it is today before. So separated in our so-called, maybe hopefully, infection-safe environmental bubbles, we can in fact experience our homes in new ways too. Maybe something positive can come out of this also. And all of us we're using the home as workplaces, as leisure areas, as gyms, as playgrounds, and so forth. And we are all confronted with the limitations of the home, but also the possibilities of this physical space that we inhabit. So I think that maybe the situation, in fact, can open up for new experiences and understandings and explorations of our very close environment. So what we could call our habitat. And today I will talk about the home or what we could call a living environment in relation to the larger society. And it will be a focus on co-housing in civil service, but also as some kind of civil service. I will look into collective and collaborative housing and different variations of these typologies. And I will look at it as a way of arranging life from the early 20th century, the formation of the welfare state, and up to the 1980s and 90s. And as you know, Stockholm will be the site for this investigation. And I also want to point out from the start here that this is an ongoing research. So I will kind of lay out a lot of questions and maybe not that many, conclusions or really results. But I'm very happy to be able to present it here today, and I'm really looking forward also hearing your reactions afterwards. So then we start here. So the collective house and co-housing are not only physical and spatial typologies, but also discursive objects that influence the Swedish policymaking and spatial planning discourse. How to articulate interpersonal relationships as well as state and individual relationships. The collective house has worked as a phenomena around which some kind of larger questions of social services has been hovering. And I propose that it had more importance maybe even as a symbolic object in the 20th century than as a concrete reality, because surprisingly few co-housing and collective housing has in fact been realized, thinking about the great attention these typologies in fact got. So it has been a number of state and municipal investigations on this topic. At the left, you see the interim report on collective houses from 1954. It's a result of the State Committee on Housing Collective that was instigated after the war, 1947. To the right is the report from the Municipal Committee for Women Questions from 1975. These two reports indicate important shifts. First, there is a shift in the level of policy making from the state, the left-hand side, to the municipal on the right-hand side. This kind of indicates a crucial shift in the form of governance, that it was decentralized in the end of the 20th century. The second crucial shifts are that the reports are representing two radically different notions of living together, from service to collaboration. And I will come back to that later. And the third notion is a shift in gender. So from a more kind of patriarchal, we could say, a kind of dominated discourse in this state investigation to a committee for women question in 75. And this kind of shift in gender balance in relation to these issues are, of course, one of the really crucial aspects here. So already in the first report, a contested field is laid out where interests of the state with universal ambitions and techniques of social regulations, such as norms and codes, seem to crash with more local and innovative ideas. On the other hand, there was a collective house that socially and spatially articulated questions of social services, especially in relation to the home and to homework and care. And on the other hand, the need to make it into a more universal service covering all citizens. So in this way, the collective house was almost framed in opposition to the public good. Instead of a possibility for the state to develop, it became some kind of threat almost. And even though the early social democrats were propagating the collective house together with modernist architects, the typology never really became a part of the welfare state's financial systems. So, and it's first in the 1980s we can see a shift. And that is also kind of coming at the same time as we see this kind of economical and political shift in the 80s. Yeah, there you see shift in policy making, shift in service to collaboration, from collective house to co-housing, and shift in gender balance. So if we just, before we go into the more spatial issues, we look into some numbers. So in Sweden, the percentage of women in paid labor was quite high in the beginning of the 20th century, partly due to the emigration to America, when millions of men left Sweden and women got a place in society and in relation to work. From the 20s to the 50s, women were pushed back into the homes as housewives, the same as in most of the other Western countries. And from the 60s, dramatic shift started. And in the beginning of the 1990s, Sweden, in fact, had the world highest rate of women with paid work. However, something peculiar is taking place at the same time as the dramatic shift takes place. When the number of women in unpaid housework change place with the numbers of women in the public sector. So here, do you see my, yeah, you do, okay. So here you have the unpaid housework. And you see that it dramatically decreases here. And here you have the public sector that is increasing dramatically. And sometimes in the end of the 70s, you have this kind of total shift. So of course, this what is happening around this point, that is of course of interest. And that is also what we're going to look more in detail into. And here, if we look at the public sector, the investment in the public sector here, and the investment in the private sector. And here you see a dramatic shift. And that is also happening. It starts to happen in the beginning of the 70s, but all through the 70s, it's an extreme shift in investments. And of course, it's kind of remarkable that you see that here women enters into the public sector, but the investments is kind of shrinking like this. So just have this in mind, and we will come back to this later. So I will have kind of three parts in this talk. The first one, I will go back in time. So I will start with the formation of the welfare state. And then I will talk a bit about services, how we can look upon that, and the meaning of co-housing in relation to a discourse around services. And I will end with talking about a kind of rethinking of labor and care, and that is related to the co-housing movement. So we start with this going back. So Sweden is well known for being some, not everyone maybe says that, but some, being one of the most advanced welfare states in the world. And it was coined as the people's home in 1928 in a mythologized speech by Per Albin Hansson. He was then the leader of the Social Democratic Party, and he became the prime minister in 1932, and he was there for many years after. However, the concept of people's home, and this is not that well known, I would say, was in fact already existing as an urban public space open for everyone regarding class, gender, and political engagement. Interestingly, the concept that came to signify the modernization of the Swedish society and the policy of the social democracy had its origin in an urban public space. And one could claim that architecture space was contributing to a policy that was later to be developed. That this kind of space had an enormous impact on the notion how to create a modern society, democratic modern society for everyone. Around 1900, an infrastructure of urban commons emerged all over Sweden, from people's kitchen and people's home to more large-scale people's houses and people's parks, as you see here. So this network of collective spaces was a fundament for the welfare state to be built on. The private domestic life and the dwelling tied into this public network, which was increasingly covered by the state covered economically, but also governed by the state since the 30s to the late 1970s. The housing policy was a cornerstone of the welfare state. And the ambition was not social housing, but rather that housing and homes became part of a biopolitical scheme to liberate, but also socialize and educate citizens, turning the worker or the proletariat into middle-class citizens. So this scheme, but this scheme that I just laid out had no place, in fact, for the collective house to develop in. On the same condition as the rest of the housing sector in Sweden. So, and that was to a large extent due to regulations and norms that the collective house could not fit into. So here you see barnrikehus. It's housing for families with many children. And that was part of the state housing policy in the 1930s. Yeah. So it was very kind of one of the really first results of the Swedish social democratic housing policy. So in the 1930s, the interest for collective houses emerged in Stockholm among politicians, architects, and intellectuals as part of the modern movement. And the number were built, in fact. And here in Acceptera, which is a publication that was published in relation to the Stockholm exhibition that introduced modernism in a Swedish context. And in Acceptera, the collective house was in fact pointed out as the future, an inspiration that could be kind of found both in West and East, and they looked into the Russian kind of really totally collectivized housing units as they explain them. And here it's a very intriguing and scary, almost kind of machine that says like here, less talented students, they go into this kind of housing cells in the big complex here. And the more talented students, they go to the university. So if you are not talented enough to go to university, you will be in this circle for the rest of your life, more or less. So this is kind of, you know, a spatial machine for a whole life cycle. And the other scheme they looked into then was the American housing cell. And here you have, you know, extremely small apartment. It's like a hotel room. and all the furniture are foldable up on the walls. And then you have the common areas in the, in the housing block as restaurants and leisure areas and so on, more or less similar to a normal hotel. The first, and so in the Swedish context, they tried somehow to, mix these two typologies, and the discussion goes between them. How large should the unit be? How much should the individual be governed, and so on. But the discussion was often very tied into spatial issues in relation to how much one should govern the individual's life. So the first and most famous collective house, designed by the Swedish architect and SIAM member Sven Markelius, in close collaboration with the social democratic politicians Alva and Gunnar Myrdal. And this was built 1935 on John Erikssonsgatan in Stockholm. See if I have, and a kindergarten, a laundry, a restaurant with food elevators into the apartments, as you can see here on the image. And shops were among the collective activities in this house. Most of the people living here were middle, upper class families. And I mean, it's kind of small unit. It's one housing block in the center, but this was what could be realized. They had many ideas of kind of making much larger areas, but no one would like to invest in this in the 30s. So in 1958, the Research Laboratory for Child Psychiatry, Barnpsykologiska forskningslaboratoriet, was inaugurated on the first floor in this building. And together with the nurse Gunhild Frendelius, they ran the kindergarten, Frendelius Kindergarten. And through one-way mirrors and sound recordings, the children's behaviors were observed. So this is kind of interesting how this building also was used as some kind of research laboratory. So even though the initiative for this, for the house for this collective house was taken partly by established politicians, it was not really followed up in the Swedish housing policy. Instead of supporting the typology and building public or cooperative collective houses, that it in fact could maybe lower the rent and make this typology more available for a larger kind of population, for the whole population. This was not anyway developed further. And this is, of course, something one could discuss for a long time, and it's many, ideas why this never happened. However, strong forces behind the collective house movements from the start were women associations such as Yrkeskvinnors Klubb, Women Clerks Organization. And even if social democratic women supported them, the men who were in charge of the housing policy did not. And here you see the Professional Women's Club in Stockholm that was opened 1939. I will just flip through these images, in fact. Despite the public housing companies and cooperatives were despite that the public housing companies and cooperatives were hesitant to back up the realization of collective houses, there was a private developer, Olle Engqvist, and he was in fact part of the group with Alva and Gunnar Myrdal and the politicians in the early 30s who discussed the possibilities of developing this housing typology, and they call themselves the social interested. So Olle Engqvist, his building company was investing in a lot of collective houses. So he became a very crucial actor on the market here. And in totally, he kind of built 18 collective houses in Sweden from the early 30s to the late 70s. So I'm going to flip through some of these here. So we have Smaragden, housing for single women. This is in the central Stockholm. And I mean, it's interesting to look into the architecture here because it's really well done and done with care and skillful insight into how spaces work and light work and so on. So architecturally, these are really kind of masterpieces, I would say. And here we have the very small apartments with a very nice way of, treating light and so forth. And here you have another by Backström and Reinius, also very kind of elaborated, Elvingwood. And yeah, you see, it's more like almost an hotel or something. Yeah. And here you have Kollektivhuset Marieberg by the architect Sven-Ivar Lind. And in fact, they really worked with architects, designer, furniture designers, and so on. So it's, the quality is very high. Here you have different spaces. To the left, you can see, for example, how, this is the public areas. All through the building and the infrastructure, the corridors are open up, so it kind of constructs this kind of collective or this kind of gathering corners and different small spaces where you could meet and speak and so on. And here you have the restaurant, and here is for kids to play. Now it looks very boring. And here you have the dinner hall and the apartment. And all the apartments in these houses were quite small then. All of the post-war collective houses, sorry, I'm going to say something about this too. This was the last collective house that Olle Engqvist was building, and it's Hässelby Familjehotel in 1955. And all of these post-war houses that I have shown now were in this way based on a labor division with employed staff and mandatory purchase of meal tickets. But in the mid-70s, the estate management was usually shut down, in fact, often with the argument of financial problems. And as noticed by Dolores Hayden, the services provided in these houses emancipated the upper and middle class women who lived in these houses, but at the same way, this structure supported the class and gender differentiation with staff serving the inhabitants. So in the end of the 1970s, most of the existing collective houses were in fact shut down. The provision of the services like restaurant, childcare, and so forth had been under threat for a long time, during the whole decade almost. And the reasons were many, but often, as I mentioned, it was related to economical issues, not problems maybe, but issues. So in Hässelby Familjehotel, the one we see here, the restaurant closed in 1976, but the inhabitants started their own restaurant. And to their surprise, the inhabitants found the work attractive, and the long-time management was in fact taking form. But then in 1979, the police stormed the collective dining hall. People were dragged out, journalists were stopped, and 11 people were taken to the police station. The event was unreasonably violent and got a lot of media attention. After a juridical decision, the inhabitants could start the restaurant again, but in new premises. The same year, as a response to these conflicts at Hässelby Family Hotel, a non-governmental bill was raised that finally resulted in the Stockholm Committee on Collective Housing, and I will come back to that later. The Stockholm Property Management Committee declared in their answer to the bill, quote, "The history writing that has taken place so far regarding Hässelby Family Hotel has meant a major defeat for private property ownership. We note that the objectives of private property owners are not in line with a socially oriented housing policy." So now, in fact, it was very clear, and it was stated from the politicians that maybe this was not really a good idea to leave the typology of collective houses to the market, because it was very hard to kind of make this into a typology that was open for everyone. This, together with the initiatives taken by individuals and groups such as Living Together, which I will soon talk about, these initiatives started, so to say, another kind of wave for collective houses, and this time it will be called then co-housing. But before I go into that phase of co-housing, the shift from collective house to co-housing, I will say something about social services. As I earlier mentioned, the collective house was a discursive object that influenced the Swedish policy making and the post-war spatial planning discourse. And I think that's kind of interesting. When I started to dig into this field, I was mainly looking at the material realization of the co-housing movement and collective houses. But then it very soon became clear that it was enormous amount of reports and state investigations and city investigations and so on. And it was rather hard to kind of limit what is, where is the discourse around co-housing, collective housing, and where is, the whole discussion around services taking on, and how are these two discourses intertwined. So here you see some of the state or municipal investigations, reports by committees and also by corporations like the Swedish Consumer Corporation that you see here. The discussion circled around how to provide a network of social services, and the concept service was very broad, and it is quite vague concept, I would say. And the word or the concept was also very, very clearly tied into the 1960s discourse of a rationalized, industrialized, large-scale society based on a division of function and labor. And this kind of planning was also later accused for being rational for business, but not for the individual citizen, who often had too long distance to the services. And this whole kind of complex around services and the planning of the modernist mass housing complex in the suburbs created a really critical public debate in the end of the 60s. And that's something we could see all over Europe. It's not typical for Sweden. But anyway, to focus on these reports and the discussion in Stockholm then, it was a very clear kind of search for a reorganized way of treating social services. So the use of services as a concept indicated an understanding of collective infrastructures based on a system with citizens not directly involved in these activities. And despite that the collective housing was considered valuable in most of these reports, large-scale services for a whole district were prioritized, even if it was criticized, which resulted, in fact, in some kind of neglection of the collective house and the potentials of living together in one unit. The notion of collective functions, services, as a social and spatial figure first emerged, in fact, in welfare state policy through the discussions on the collective house in the 1930s. But later, when it was framed in relation to the abstract and not really situated notion of services, it was done in some kind of opposition to the typology of collective houses. So I would say one could argue that the reports reveal these reports reveal the contested field between a women-driven discourse from the start, the collective house discourse, that focused on spatial and articulated on spatial issues, and also articulated the small scale, everyday life services or something. So that was the one side, and the other side was the dominating position that the politician took all the time up to the 80s. That was more arguing for some kind of efficient, large-scale services. And often on a very abstract level. So even though the state reports partly supported the collective house, it was not prioritized. It was not a prioritized typology. And this report contributed to a discourse not enabling the collective house to be developed in the state-supported public housing. So until the 1980s, the primary aim with collective services was to unburden the households, mainly the women, from the work related to housework and childcare. But already in the mid-1970s, a critical discourse kind of emerged that lifted up homework and care as a potential social resource, a social capital that would enrich the community and its social infrastructure. So instead of looking upon services now framed as care, not as a burden, but as a social resource, as something that kind of enhanced the social capital. There we have, a huge shift. So here I just want to flip through also some of the kind of formats the notion of services took as a spatial, expression in these reports. So you have the service note, for example, and think about, that the discussion more or less, if you do it very simple in a way, it starts with this kind of housing unit, the collective house, but the services created in this kind of small scale unit was not enough for the whole area. So all these attempts are kind of ideas or attempts to solve the issue of, enabling services to a larger community. So here, services are and collective activities are kind of moved out into what is called the service knot. And here is something similar. You have the service center put in the center of here. I guess it's a largest city. And here you see kind of diagrams, discussion, the interaction between the individual building and the social services. I will not go into this, but anyway, you could understand that. Yeah. And here you have Sollentuna Service House with 1,247 apartments. And this is in a way, you know, meeting the critique of the new built suburban areas outside Stockholm. This is in a way a small scale of a large scale mass produced suburb, but here more framed as a house. So it's something between a suburb and a house. And here you have the same kind of idea, but it's a bit smaller. It has instead 538 apartments. And I mean, these kind of structures are quite similar to what we maybe see today as service houses for elderly people or targeted groups. But here it was not kind of made for a special group in society. Okay, going back a bit to these diagrams, the rethinking of services in relation to the built environment and the potential of the collective house coincided with a larger societal transformation, also related to the service sector. Around 1970, the official and visible service sector, and then not including unpaid homework, for the first time employed more people than the industrial and building sector. And you could see that on this diagram. Here you have the public and private services going up here, housing and industry. Going down in the 70s, and farming is kind of declining the whole 20th century, during the whole 20th century. But also here you see that the most dramatic shifts takes place in the end of the 70s and then kind of continues. For the first time in the end of the 1970s, as I said before, it's the same diagram you see there, more women worked in public sector than with unpaid housework. But it was a contradictory time, and when the service grew, the rate of public investment in fact halved from 1970 to 1980. And I said that also before, so you have heard that. So I move from these diagrams now. I think maybe you have gotten the picture there, what happened. So now I will enter into the last phase here of this lecture. So before, I just want to say one more thing in relation to services and the diagrams. It's like this, when so much happens at the same time, also in society and economical shifts, you have women entering into the public sphere and in fact doing maybe care work, but paid care work. And then the investment in the public sector is decreasing so much during the same period. Then some kind of gap becomes very obvious. How to we need to have some kind of interventions in relation to care and public services in this situation. So it's very obvious that care and services becomes an urgent question in relation to growing service sector and decreasing public investing, so to say. So, in 1980, the same year, Dolores Hayden asked for, quote, a new paradigm of the home, end quote, in her article, What Would a Non-Sexist City Be Like? A group of Swedish women proposed a reorganized version of the traditional collective house to fit the 1980s society. Like a playful wink to what Hayden stated as the most critical principle, often implicit, for architectural design and urban planning in the last century, quote, a woman's place is in the home. This group, in fact, stayed at home, and they made the home into a space for societal change, but on their own terms. At the 1980 exhibition, you can see the catalog here, Boplatz 80, the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm exhibition, the catalog here, that introduced modernism in the Swedish context. And I referred to that earlier in relation to Acceptera also. The group that called themselves Bo I gemenskap, living in community, and the acronym is BIG. They presented this furnished dollhouse in scale 1 to 12, as a dollhouse has. Children, adults, teenagers, cats and dogs inhabited this space, and the interiors were carefully designed with woven carpets, wooden table, handmade lamps, and patterned wallpaper. So the group BIG argued that the individual dwelling needed revision after a long time of intense critique towards contemporary modernist building and housing policy. So importantly, together with an architectural renewal of housing, BIG rethought social reproduction. And that is, of course, as important as what they did, you know, in a more aesthetic and a spatial sense. So labor and care was rethought in relation to the home. Instead of seeing unpaid work in the domestic sphere as a burden, something to reject, they stressed it as a resource in its capacity to create this kind of interpersonal relations and human infrastructures. So, and of course, men and women could participate in this work on an equal base. And that was, I mean, maybe ground rule number one here. So here, the discussion in a way deviates a bit from other examples, other groups working with this topic, such as the International Feminist Collective that struggled for women to get paid for housework as a way to escape the role of being a housewife. And like Silvia Federici expressed in her text, Wages Against Housework, quote, wages for housework is the first step towards refusing it, end of quote. But here we should remember that, as I showed with the graphs earlier, that it was a very high level of employed women in Sweden. And that's why maybe BIG took this, you know, choose this way of framing their struggles, not to fight for, you know, wages for housework, but in the opposite, to kind of rethink what does it mean to work with, you know, care and housework as some kind of a resource. So the dollhouse model was an alteration of a modernistic smalhus narrow block from the 1930s. It was a barnrikehus built for families with many children, and I showed you one earlier too, in Stockholm. So this typology was a result of the state investigation that laid the ground for Swedish welfare state policy. Bostadssociala utredningen, housing social investigation. The reconstruction of this iconic building turned it from a housing block built as a highly regulated social space, aiming at fostering families with many children, into a more open space that integrated activities and functions. So the refurbishment that Big proposed was very modest, in fact, and the apartments on the first, second, and third level, they were not changed at all. You could see them here. But it's only the bottom level that it's totally turned into some kind of open space and collective space. So, I mean, what they did with this building was that they showed that with very little kind of changes in the material structure, but important shifts and changes, you could kind of change the whole way you could live together. So the model demonstrated the interior of a living community where the inhabitants activated spaces. There were sewing machines, workshops, bedrooms, large kitchens, and so forth. So picking up on what I would call a feminist, postmodern, and playful critique, the dollhouse was not only a critique of authoritarian and patriarchal large-scale modernist planning and gender and labor division, but it was also a provocation to architecture and urban planning's professional culture with its very strict limitations of norms, taste, and quality. So the patriarchal professional culture overlapped in many ways with the limitation of the welfare state housing policy that in fact had been hindering this experimentation of new collective forms all through the 20th century up to the 80s. So the ideology that framed the first wave collective houses promoted services. And the 1970s crisis forced to question this relationship from a practical standpoint, as shown in the case of Hässelby Family Hotel when the police came. But at the same time, the discourse on collective housing overlapped with an emerging feminist movement in Nordic architecture, with formations of groups in the late 1970s, such as Nordiska Kvinnors Byggeplan Forum, Nordic Women's Building and Planning Forum, and Bo i gemenskap, living together, as I mentioned, and Women Building Forum, and so on. It's more there. But pioneering conferences were part of this formation of a feminist architecture and planning perspective. And we have some examples here. And the symposium in St. Louis in '74 was in fact crucial for the development of the Swedish movement. And so it's interesting with these kind of transnational relations that in fact created this movement too. So instead of foregrounding aesthetic expressions, this postmodern movement took its starting point in personal dreams and how to create another kind of everyday life. So the feminist movement articulated decisive perspectives on architecture and planning. And a new landscape of political power emerged, but also following Nancy Fraser's notion of a triple movement, this emancipatory act could also overlap with marketizations in new constellations, even if that from the start was not the intention. But I will come back a bit with that too. The complex trajectory of the collective house movement was shown in a witness seminar with BIG, that action archive, as Salomon, you mentioned in the start, that we organized in 2019. And this group, we're working with some kind of participatory history writing. And I have this group together with my colleagues, Sara Brolund de Carvalho and Michael Schalk. So anyway, here we discuss the incentives for engaging in questions around collective living and home and care work. The first discussions that later led to the formation of BIG gathered practitioners from architecture, design, and journalism, and they all shared interest, though, in feminism in relation to urban space, architecture, and planning. And their ideas, in fact, on housing was not specifically addressed as a feminist project, even if they had, you know, some kind of ground there. But it was more, but more importantly here, was that the discussion took its starting point in the everyday life, in dreams and desires. So it's really this kind of the personal is the political. What social circles do family structures and spatial organization create outside the family borders, and what impact does it have on society at large? So these questions was, I mean, at the table for them, how the most kind of private, personal goes through different layers of the family, the intermediary level, and the larger society, and what kind of infrastructures is at work here. As mentioned, Sweden in the early 1990s had the world highest level of women with salaried work. But consequently, lifestyle and gender role changed. But according to these women in BIG, the organization of everyday life and built space did in fact not change. So looking back today, most of them stress the life situation with children, absent men, intense work, and dwellings not supporting the way they lived. So here's a quote: we could turn our dreams and express them in organization and space, and we aim for realization. And this is also very crucial here, that it's not, you know, a paper project. It's something that they want to really, you know, turn into reality. In the way the 1968 urban activists criticized the welfare state for generational segregation, separating young and old, BIG reacted against the suburban planning and enforced against the suburban planning enforcing similar segregation. And one of the members in the group, she said, like, it was at the time one had to prove so much. It was taken for granted that I should have these two kids and a man that was traveling all the time. Also they criticized the suburban areas they all were living in. It was not planned for children and adults to socialize. Mothers should sit on the bench and the children should be in the sandbox, and the swing sets were not made for adults. It was astonishing. So I really longed for another way of living together with my kids. Continuing the legacy from the Swedish feminist Elin Wägner, who saw the emergence of the early modern society in the 1930s as some kind of silent revolution, first manifested in the everyday life of women. BIG turned away from the 1968 Marxist perspective of changing life through labor, which demanded a revolution and thereby positioned change of life as a utopia of the future. Instead, they argued that we need immediate change here and now. And they wanted to change, as I said, domestic housework through new spatial organizations of the home. And in this way, somehow they in fact tied back into the early modernist biopolitical ideas, almost, that the spatial environment is very closely tied to some kind of social contract and forming habits and possibilities, and of course also limitations. But the role of space in the making of a society. And of course, they also, one critique, or the critique was targeted towards this kind of large-scale services that we had seen in, the suburbs, but also this kind of almost mega structures like Sollentuna service house and the one in the Fältöversten in the center of Stockholm. But they were also, as I said before, reacting towards that homework had been turned into paid work, that was the only way to kind of handle this situation of homework. And then it gained value as time units that could be sold on the labor market. But and otherwise it was, so to say, invisible and outside the economy. So, they really wanted to find some other way to make it, visible and present in society, but not to turn it into something that could be sold and bought on the market. So in this book, The Lilla Kollektivhuset, the small co-housing, that was published in 1982, the group provided concrete advices on how to set up a living community. And this book was widely spread and used as a guidance for politicians, architects, and people who wanted to start a co-housing. And even if they were not the first one to formulate these ideas, this book turned a whole discourse into a format that was easy to take on, to bring with, to relate to refer to, and so on. It also, in fact, tied into other postmodern discussions on housing in the 80s. So they proposed what they call an intermediary level, the living community. And you see it here. It's this level in between the large society and the private sphere. The size of the new unit was somewhere between the traditional collective house and the big family, and approximately 20 to 50 households. A number of care and household functions were supposed to move from the little household of the family to the intermediary level of the living community. And even if the possibility for the community to take over specific functions, such as elderly care, that was also pointed out in this publication. So today, when we look back, this shift, in fact, raises further questions about, societal responsibilities, liability issues. And these were not really kind of addressed at this time, but that would, of course, be very crucial topics in the 80s and 1990s regime of new public management. So in Big's description, the living community always had spatial aspects, but it was not primarily kind of framed as a building. Instead, their version was turned into a model for how to think around this kind of new ways of structuring the everyday life. So in international discussions on co-housing, the importance is often stressed of bottom-up processes. But here in the Swedish context, also learning from Hässelby Familjehotel and other collective houses, that profit making had destroyed the collaboration. So this book, in fact, advocated other models where co-housing companies, and then it was preferably public or cooperative, took initial responsibility, and the citizen moved in at a larger state. It could also be some kind of collaboration from the start with citizens working together with a public company, but they were really kind of stressing the value of having, the city or the municipality or some kind of political support in this initiative. So even though Big's handbook, I call it that here, or manual, collected and articulated ideas that were discussed at the time, the book was influential and important for the realization of this new type of collective houses that we now call co-housing then. So one of the first examples is this one, Stolplyckan in Linköping, and I'm very sorry for the images here. I should not blame Corona too much, maybe, but it's very hard to kind of dig into archives and so during these periods. However, this building opened in 1982, so it ties into discussions that almost came before the book was produced, but it's part of the same discourse. And the architects Höje Ljungqvist, they describe this building maybe as more a mix between the older collective houses and this kind of second wave co-housing. But in fact, the developer, together with Linköping's municipality, broke new ground here with this project because they collaborated from the start with citizens, with building constructors and the city. Kindergarten and service apartments for elderly were integrated in the housing block, and staff in those institutions were also available for the inhabitants in Stolplyckan. So this kind of unit, they still provided services, but it was a mix. So in the night, the inhabitants organized dinners themselves, and the premises could be used by everyone living in the house. So what was kind of kindergarten in the day could be something else in the night. So in the beginning of the 1990s, the architect and professor in building function analysis, Birgit Krantz, she argued that this Stolplyckan was a materialization of local care at the level between the individual and the society, such as the parents' organization of childcare corporations. But she also pointed out that the ongoing dismantling of the public sector and the parents' wish to engage more in their kids' everyday life. But this kind of dilemma was not really developed further. She's just pointing towards this kind of, complicated relation between engaging more in care at the same time as the public sector is kind of dismantling. So the first co-housing that was realized that looked more like the ones that were described in the little collective house with, not more than 20 to 50 households, were in fact opened already in 1980 in Göteborg. And this is a refurbished building from the 1960s. It's called Stacken, the Stack. And it was realized by a group from Chalmers School of Architecture, and it was led by the professor Lars Ågren. So this is really a fascinating project, and Claes Kaldenby, a Swedish architectural historian, he has followed this project and he has written much about it during the years, and one of the texts I sent to you was also written by him, so I think you could read more about it there. However, as I said earlier too, the big manual was used not only by action groups and housing companies, but also by politicians. So the vice mayor, Mats Hult, appointed a committee on collective housing in Stockholm municipal in 1980. That was a result of the conflict at, partly anyway, a result of the conflict at Hässelby Familjehotel. In 1980, the committee organized a competition open for all citizens on how collective living forms could be developed to, quote, stimulate the debate and to get the Stockholmers' own perspectives on collective houses. So now suddenly it's a very different tone around collective houses. And here is the advertisement for the competition. And here you have the report from the final report from this municipal Stockholm Commission. So the directives pointed out that collective living should be developed, the directives in the competition and in this report, to increase interaction between people and stimulate affinity, end of quote. It was argued that in the last decenniums, common societal functions or social functions had either been transferred into a private home or out to the large society. And following the feminist sociologist Rita Liljeström and the group BIG, among others, they stress now the importance of developing the intermediary level through people's everyday life. So it was, yeah, as I said, a very kind of different position taken by the politicians at this time. At the point in time when forces of neoliberalization emerged and a new public management took form, the struggles against social privatization must be understood in relation to state retrenchment that opened for a wave of economic privatization in society. And I mean, this kind of struggle against social privatization was what was kind of driving the feminist movement and the co-housing movement. So as stated by the Stockholm politicians, the centralization and specialization of care and nursing had been questioned both from a humanitarian perspective, but also from an economic. Higher demands were made from the politicians on increasing participation and dissolution of the boundaries between home and institution. The collective house was seen as a response to several demands and created a good foundation for, quote, a decentralized administrative responsibility and an increasing personal responsibility for the residents. So somehow some kind of possibility for the state to redraw and for inhabitants to take more responsibility. The pilot projects presented by the committee, this one, did not only have the value as collective houses, but also as, quote, knowledge for collective elements in housing in general, end of quote. So in this way, the collective house once again became a model for the society, and also, I would say, with the risk that large-scale perspective slightly shifted the meaning with what Big described as the intermediary level. So, yeah, something is is happening here, some kind of power struggle over concepts and ideas. So as shown, maybe I should jump here. I see that I have, okay, I do like this. Press order. Okay, what I could say is like very many but quite many collective houses will be built during the 80s. And over a period of 10 years, 24 co-housing were built in Stockholm. And in the whole of Sweden, 64 houses were built. And then it became a period of stagnation. And in the 90s again, it started a new kind of movement, you could say. But I will not go into that now. But what I will do is to have a conclusion, to conclude this somehow, as much as I can. But I will lay out some ideas that maybe we could talk a bit about. The 1980s co-housing movement efforts in redefining services strengthen the role of collaboration and care through organizing domestic space. And this is, in fact, something that is still, I would say, needs to be more explored to understand the full impact of this kind of events. They manage in a way to position the domestic sphere in the realm of architecture and spatial practice, and thereby stressing architecture's social contract once again, and with that echoing the spaces of the early 20th century people's home that I showed in the start. But there is also another perspective to understand. Have we once again witnessed a period where collective living has been used in policy making as a discursive object? This time, not in the planning of large scale, not in the name of large scale planning, but in what sociologist Magnus Dahlstedt calls the politics of activation, that defines the shift in Sweden from a state-centered to an individual-centered regime. A number of housing environments, from the individual dwelling to the block and also the larger area, have been influenced by this 1980s co-housing discourse, from housing exhibitions to, whole city areas, for example, Södra Stationen, Bo 85, there was an exhibition. And what was it, in fact, that happened around the 1980s when women entered into the paid labor market, mainly through service jobs in the public sector, paid care work, and exactly then did the same sector drastically decrease the investment? In the sociologist Melinda Cooper's analysis of the American society, she understands this mechanism as a backlash for women emancipation. When women got paid work in the public sector, the critique towards the sector increased. So in a way, a question why that was stated at that time: why should taxpayers pay for work that earlier was for free? So I think that's extremely interesting analysis, but of course it might not be the whole truth about the Swedish context. But the politicians, they were really searching for solutions for self-organized care and social services in time of radical savings. So I think we could not kind of neglect this fact that these two events could be tied into each other somehow. So, however, what could be learned here is maybe that architecture's social contract is always tied into larger political goals, and that it is written into the discipline of architecture. Architecture in civil service will always point back to the architect and all the other involved actors and raise the questions around whose civil servant am I in this context. Anyway, I want to stress the importance that architects engage in civil service and keep the social contract of architecture alive. from my view, it's no option to stand outside politics or civil service. Rather, the opposite. There are no clean sites for architecture to act upon. But as architects, we can only remind ourselves that it's always a question of being critical and making trouble somehow. And that is for sure something that we could learn from this 1980s co-housing movement that in fact has moved away from this situation and turned into so many different activities after the 80s, but that's totally another story. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Helena, for a very inspiring lecture. I especially appreciate the summation at the end for a new call for another generation. I know that some of the students had prepared questions. Maria, in advance, maybe if you stop screen sharing, you can see, well, everybody's face here.
Yeah, so where do you have that?
There we go.
Yeah, so
hi,
no,
Maria.
how should I?
Do you
see
maybe
my
you
screen?
can.
I stopped it already.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, because I couldn't do it.
Oh, sorry. Maria, maybe you can wave your hand so you can, Helena can see you.
Yeah.
Do you see her? Yeah.
Yeah, but
Here, hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for the lecture. It was really inspiring. So I had a question. You were speaking in the second part of your lecture as well as in the third one about looking into state reports and as well as articles in newspapers as means to understand the dynamics of these projects, always regarding women's position inside and outside the household. So we're currently in this semester, we're undertaking a seminar. We're having a seminar on space, television, and architecture. So in our first session, we had some readings. We were reading some parts of Spiegel's book on television and the way it actually earned its place inside the household in America. So in this book, Spiegel was looking at women's magazines as viable source of historical evidence. As means, so these magazines could tell us about ways women experienced everyday life and how these magazines played a key role in addressing women's position inside or outside the household back at the time. So I was wondering if during your research you have delved into such magazines in Sweden and what role they could play in this discourse.
Yes, I have, in fact. I haven't looked into them specifically. Did you think about some, maybe I missed, I understood that you looked into women magazines. What kind of women magazines?
Well, they were not in Sweden, they were back in America. So I think...
was it more like mainstream or, popular magazines,
yes,
not
popular,
like feminist, manifest. Okay. Yes, I mean, in Sweden, it has been the discourse about the home has been very present in fact, in women magazines. And in fact, it was a dissertation by Maria Perez on this topic, on the good home. And she followed, magazines from the 30s, 40s up to the 60s, 70s. And of course you could read very much about, how you look upon the domestic space and things like that through these magazines. I have not really been looking into that in this case, so I can't say so much in relation to co-housing, in fact, but I think it's important sources to work with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, so
So in my undergraduate, I studied interior design in a program that had developed out of home economics, and then went on to work in restaurant design. And I wanted to ask about the kind of the space of the kitchen in particular, because it's such a, I think, a very gendered space, where like the home kitchen is designed for, I guess, women, and then the restaurant kitchen is designed for men. And I was curious if the kind of kitchen layouts or the concept of the kitchen for Big had any kind of differences in the layouts or the ergonomics of it.
Interesting question. I haven't really thought about that, I have to say, but of course it's some kind of, I mean, the typology of the kitchen is crucial here, because I mean, the dwellings more or less, they are shrinked. I mean, it's not that big difference in a way. It's more like you take some kind of square meters from the apartment and you put that into, you know, the common areas. But the kitchen, of course, has to function very differently, you know, family kitchen. And it comes closer to a restaurant kitchen, of course. Now we have to think that in Sweden, it has been this kind of very worked out, you know, regulations around the kitchen and homework and so forth. So I would be surprised if they were not following these regulations that are laid out. So I could imagine, and I haven't really looked into, you know, the difference between the regulations in the restaurant kitchen and in the home. But I think the notion of also kitchen as a gender space and what that means, what it means for the kitchen as a, you know, unit to be located in the family or in a larger community or in this intermediary level is that's kind of interesting, in fact. Thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Masha. And then there is also a question that was placed in the chat, but following Masha, maybe we can ask that.
Okay. I wanted to know what was the...
So now I don't see you. Where are you?
I am here.
There, okay.
I wanted to know the correlation between collective housing or co-housing and workplaces. So it was like the first aim to make women more comfortable to work. So how it's happened in European cases, because we read about what would the non-sexist city be like, that it was a problem between suburbs and place of work. So you also mentioned that there was a suburb of collective housing. Maybe it's interesting to know what was the relationship between workplaces and
yeah. I mean, if one looks back and starts to think about, you know, the 40s, 50s and 60s, you know, when I showed you this service, the reports and all these things, it was a hot topic, so to say, you know, to kind of analyze services that the workplace was part of this, you know, human infrastructure of services. So for an individual, it should be, you know, some kind of radio, what do you say? Yeah, you know, not too far to the workplace and to the shops and to all the social functions around the housing. But so then we have seen very many, you know, deviations in relation to where you position the housing and the workspace, so to say, from the large-scale suburbs, where one of the critiques were that it was too far, you know, both to the workplace, but also to shops and other services. So, you know, it was a very large distance that the citizen had to travel, so to say. But then if you look, for example, at the I mean, in the city, it's another situation, of course, with this small scale co-housing. Then it's more like, you know, a normal housing block or something that maybe you haven't really kind of planned it in relation to the workspace, but often it's, you know, situated in a dense area where things are kind of incorporated more well, so to say. So if we look into the co-housing movement, the little collective house, the notion of, you know, the planning of the workspace is not really related to the co-housing, I would say. It's not that kind of large scale planning we are talking about. Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you. I saw Xavier. You were waving.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Oh, was there another one?
Go ahead, and then we will give it over to our other colleague who wrote the question in the chat. He should feel free to just speak up too. No problem.
Okay, sorry. Well, two questions, but more from perhaps the social sciences. The first one, from my own experience, having upper and middle class people associated with collectiveness is something that does not exist. How do you explain that in Sweden? That link I don't understand very well. And the second one has to do with the fact that what is it about co-housing and collectivism in Sweden? Is there something in the Swedish cultural DNA that is different from other countries, or is this just a very specific example and numerically is insignificant in Swedish culture? I'm not sure if I'm clear, but I from your lecture and what I read about it, I was fascinated by the importance of community and the social fabric in a way that I have not seen in many other countries.
So thank you. The first question was that you wondered about the connection between middle and upper class and collective house. Did I understand you right then? Yeah, that it was so connected to those social classes, so to say. Yeah, okay. Yeah, in the start, because
in my experience, it would be the lower strata more associated with this.
Yeah. I think it has to do with it started, you know, early welfare state there with Alva and Gunnar Myrdal, and you know, it was very progressive in all senses, you know, thinking about care, health care, sexuality, education, you know, all these kind of different, you know, areas that was supposed to be modernized. So in that respect, the notion of living together and kind of experiment with life forms was something for the intellectual world. It was, you know, you had to create this kind of new human modern subject. And you could do that through organizing, housing and living. So, I mean, in that sense, the whole housing policy is of such a great importance and interest, I think, because it has so much to do with constructing, you know, the new modern citizen, as much as, you know, giving shelter for someone who has not a home. So it's much more than, you know, a house, as Rainer Banham said. And then, so that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that, you know, it's many professional women going into clubs and organizations that wants to have support with their children. And it was cheaper to live in a collective house than to have a maid. So in that sense, yeah, it was some kind of service thing. And the second question, I'm not sure, you know, I'm a bit hesitant always to this kind of, that it's, you know, in cultural DNA or something like that. I think, but maybe, I don't know. I heard now during Corona, in fact, you know, they compared Sweden, Italy, and Finland, how many people you meet every day. And then it was, I can't remember, but in Finland it was like 14, maybe in Sweden it was 25, and in Italy it was like 60 or something, I don't know. But, you know, it was a very kind of more intense social interaction in different contexts then. And I'm not sure if we could have something to do with that, that, you know, it's a country that it's not fully packed with people, and it has been a problem with isolation, and the weather is not that good. So that is also kind of supporting this, you know, social isolation. And then the quick modernization and this large-scale planning and so on, and rationality maybe also did that. So in relation to this kind of modern, you know, rational planning, not only architecture planning, but also social planning, maybe some kind of, you know, wish for creating, you know, community. And of course, as I said in the reports too, you see it's a very important issue in thinking about building a new society. But that's, I mean, it's the same in England with community planning and so on, and garden cities. And I mean, so we have, so I guess it's a topic going through planning all the way, in fact.
Helena, hi. I don't know if you can see me.
Yeah.
Hi,
yes, I see you. Hi.
Yes, I posted the question in the chat. I just find it kind of easier to put my ideas down. So one of the advantages of online. If you don't mind, I will read it. Thank you very much for the fantastic and fascinating lecture. I had actually two questions. One is that I share your final call about, you know, the social contract of architecture and the political role of architecture and the architecture profession that in a way cannot be escaped. And I think you end up with this kind of claim to, you know, let's be critical and let's make trouble. And I wonder if there is something to ask to that as well, in the sense that who is in a position to be critical and make trouble? And aren't we leaving this now to people in a position of power or you know, privilege, or maybe in academia when you have to actually, you know, architecture is your means of living? I think I found it a bit problematic, no, if we leave it like this. And the second question is more a question about the ways of cohousing in Sweden that you were describing, and whether your project is going to reach nowadays, and if you think there is like a third wave of cohousing at the moment. I mean, my provocation is to say that I would argue that there is a current cohousing movement. Not sure in Sweden, I'm not sure, but I think in Europe, and I think it has been in the discourse, it has been framed as a response to the financial failure of the market, and how now citizens are kind of coming together to organize their own way of living. So it's an opportunity, and whether this is happening in Sweden, and if you are planning to study. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I start with your first question here. Yeah, I mean, that's of course very relevant, but I also think that you know, this to be critical and make trouble. I mean, make trouble, it sounds a bit kind of phony maybe, but you know, not be that easy, or be aware of what kind of context you are positioned in. Because I mean, you could argue that you don't want to deal with topics as an architect that is too complicated, or I think often when you work together with politicians, you end up, I'm thinking also of the topic for this, you know, the course, that what you are working with, civil services and civil, yeah. What was I saying? Yeah, you know, always when you work with politicians, I think it's almost unavoidable not that your work will be used on very many different levels, because you know, you work with bureaucracy, you work with economy, you as a politician, you have such a broad field of disciplines that you need to be, you know, interacting with, so to say. And the ideas and notions that the architects bring into the sphere also become something that will be used by others in ways we could never, you know, find out. And I think it's no use for us to believe that we could, you know, state an idea that should be clean and clear and go through all processes not, you know, affected, so to say, that it was that is kept as we intended it to be. So what I mean here is that for an architect who enters into this field, you know, so in that way, it's maybe more a call for the privileged, maybe, as you said there, because you have maybe already got the job, so to say. And when you are there, I think it's, you know, of great importance that you are aware of this, you know, the play. And of course, you can't, you know, ask for all architects to take responsibility for everything. But I think anyway, it's a good question to ask yourself: who am I? You know, what I am a civil servant for who, and in what way? And yeah, and be as much aware as you can. So that is what I mean with, you know, making trouble or being critical, and also dare to kind of make trouble when you need to make trouble. And you could do it not through words, but through, you know, spatial presentations or, you know, propositions. Architecture can be troublesome in itself. You know, we can use our tools in a way. Okay, and the second question, yes. I also think that is, you know, a kind of a wave today that takes very many different expressions, also in the corporate world, much more than before. So, I mean, in Stockholm, we have many kind of corporate co-housing that works maybe more or less as a hotel, but yeah, some kind of mix. You share some things and some not, and so on. And then, for example, it's a very interesting example in Helsingborg in south of Sweden, where it's an integration of immigrants, elderly people, students living together in this collective house called Selbo. And in fact, it sounds like a utopia in a way, but it seems like it works quite well. So it's a very interesting case of a new co-housing. Yeah. And the group BIG, they are very active today. You know, they do very many things today. So that's kind of fascinating.
Well, I think that's a nice way to end, Helena. Thank you very much again, and for, well, I very much appreciate trying to, well, bringing it into a context, this idea of civic service and what that has meant. You know, we had a set of other historical case studies from the 19th century, a different kind of political context, but then trying to really maybe put this agency forward. And that was part of the idea for this, well, for starting to enter now more into a kind of contemporary discussion to see how can we basically form architects that are politicized beings, let's put it that way. So thank you. And I do hope that there is another moment to, of course, meet in person.
Yeah.
So well, maybe we can give a round of applause. I think it's nice to not be on mute, but to actually hear hear the clapping.
Oh,
it gives a little bit more momentum than simply
exactly.
emojis. So thanks again.